If you were to ask me what my favorite game was, truthfully, I wouldn't have an answer for you. It's like asking a parent to pick their favorite child. So let's say we narrow it down by genre. 2D platformer, 3D platformer, fighting game, shooter, strategy, puzzle, etc. And then we have a little game called the Stanley Parable, which doesn't fit into any of these categories, but I would definitely put it above most, if not all of the games you see here. I think part of the reason I love it as much as I do is because it's so wildly different, but it's also very hard to talk about. So I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. I've been trying to write a video about the Stanley Parable on and off for about 2 years now. Every time I start a new script, I always end up stopping midway through, and that's for a pretty simple reason. As you can probably imagine, I try to make videos where I have something meaningful to say that no one else does, or at least that I haven't seen someone else do. And because the Stanley Parable is such a different game, it's one of those games that tend to attract the more existential side of YouTube. But I wouldn't be talking to you right now if I didn't have anything to say about it. The truth is, I have had something to say about this game for about 2 years now. In fact, I've had a lot to say about it. Simply put, I think this game uses its gameplay to tell the kind of story that you could only tell in a video game. The only problem is trying to elaborate on that statement in a way that sounds interesting to the average viewer, which is difficult if you're not looking at it from the right angle.
Pedro, won't you take the wheel?
If you don't already know, the Stanley Parable was originally created as a total conversion mod for Half-Life 2 in 2011. After its critical success, it was rebuilt from the ground up as a standalone game and released on Steam in 2013. The game had a huge spike in popularity after garnering attention from the biggest YouTubers at the time, including PewDiePie, Jacksepticeye, Markiplier, etc., which left a huge impact on the game's creator, Davey Wreden, as well as its massive player base, which eventually grew to be over 1 million. Wreden released a follow-up called The Beginner's Guide in 2015, which I may or may not talk about some other time, who knows, and at the Game Awards in 2018, the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe was announced, with tons of new content as well as a console release coming in 2019, although it's been delayed twice now and still has yet to see the light of day. You can follow the developers on Twitter if you don't want updates. The Stanley Parable opens with a cutscene that introduces us to a narrator who introduces us to Stanley, whose entire life consists of mindlessly pushing buttons on a keyboard in response to directions from a monitor on his desk. One day, the orders stop coming in, and Stanley gets up to investigate. From there, we take control of Stanley as the narrator guides us through the story. Very early on, it becomes apparent that this game is about making choices that lead to different endings. On its own, this is nothing special, and I think that a lot of people have overlooked the game as a result of this. You can make the argument that almost every game involves decision-making, but there are much fewer games that feature decision-making as a central mechanic. There are even fewer whose entire premise revolves around the concept of player choice and free will, and this is exactly what the Stanley Parable does. The concept of different endings is something the narrator doesn't shy away from. In fact, he actively embraces it. He acknowledges that there are different endings, and he brings them up to the player on multiple occasions. What other game can you think of that does that? It's not like you'll be playing Super Metroid fighting Ridley, and all of a sudden, he stops, looks directly at you, and says, "Hey, Samus. Hey, Samus. If you save the animals when the planet is about to blow up, you get a different ending." And then Samus would probably say, "Why would you even want to tell me that? You killed my parents." Oh wait, sorry, did you say the planet is gonna blow up? And sure, maybe a game will encourage the player to try for a different ending, but it's usually disconnected from the game world in some way. On the contrary, the Stanley Parable will bring up this fact every chance it gets. The game is trying to build a world in which the story itself exists in its own narrative, and by looking at what the game considers to be an ending, we can find out why that is. If the story itself is part of the story, then the different endings should tell us what they say about the world of the game. The only problem there is that there really is no definition set in stone. Most endings result in a restart. The screen will go black and the game will start over from the beginning. but not all endings work like that. Take for instance the confusion ending, in which the game restarts 4 times before everything goes back to normal. The heaven ending, which requires 5 different playthroughs just to reach. The broom closet and whiteboard endings, which are just single rooms that you find along the way. The museum ending, which goes to black but never restarts unless you do it manually. Or the serious ending, which you can only get to if you try to enable cheats in the console, which is only accessible by enabling it through the game's launch options. But maybe the point is specifically to not have certain criteria for what constitutes an ending. Look at the game's loading screen. It literally says the end is never. They say it's about the journey, not the destination, and I think this is really where we start to understand what's going on here and why things are the way that they are. The choices in this game consist of walking through doors, pressing buttons, taking staircases, pretty much everything you would expect an office building to have. As you explore the different endings, the complexity of the choices varies, but something that I've noticed is fundamental to the game's design is this office setting, because of what it says about Stanley and the player. By all accounts, Stanley is a slave to the system. He sits at a desk staring at a screen and pushing buttons on a keyboard all day every day, and not only that, but he also enjoys it. Only when the orders stop coming in is he forced to get up and investigate, and that's when the player takes over. He's a walking stereotype. That brings us to the doors. This is the first choice that the game clearly lays out in front of you, and I would consider it to be the most important moment of the whole game. That's because of what the narrator says here. You would probably expect him to say, Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, but instead he says,
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
So why does he approach it this way? Well, according to the narrator, Stanley is mentally stimulated by a few things: clear direction, consistency, and simplicity. All needs which are met by following the narrator's instructions. But Stanley isn't real. We as humans are more complex than that. Simply following orders without question isn't enough for most people. The narrator even acknowledges this.
And although others might have considered it soul-rending, Stanley relished every moment that the orders came in, as though he had been made exactly for this job.
He acknowledges that Stanley is an outlier. Do you ever find yourself about to do something and then someone tells you to do that thing and then you get annoyed and don't want to do it anymore? Or maybe someone tells you not to do something and that makes you want to do it even more?
If I'd said Stanley walked past the broom closet, at least you would have had a reason for exploring it to find out.
When the narrator says that Stanley entered the door on the left, that door on the right starts to look a lot more appealing. In an interview with Vice from 2011, Davey Reedon said, "I've loved games all my life and I've always loved narration and story delivery, but I rarely see anything particularly surprising done with it, so I just asked myself what would happen if I threw players up against an unconventional narrator. Really, the seed of the game was just that one question, a desire to know what would happen if you were able to disobey the narrator, and I had no idea, so I just went about making it to find out." I will admit, when I showed this game to my friend Ilani, she didn't realize that she didn't have to listen to the narrator and then said she wasn't having fun when she got to the freedom ending. This made it very frustrating to watch at the time, but now that I look back on it, I'm kind of glad it happened. The irony here is that this ending wants to paint Stanley as a man freed from the shackles of a literal mind control facility, finally able to think for himself, but it's the least satisfying ending as a real person because in order to get here, you have to do everything that the narrator tells you. I would encourage other people to watch their friends play this game and see how they react to it, and for the record, I wouldn't consider Ilani a blind follower. I think it says more about her level of disinterest and willingness to put up with me than anything else. There's one ending that expands upon this idea. Most of the choices in the game are laid out clearly in front of us, but there's one in particular that takes some digging to find on top of simply not listening to the narrator. In this room, the narrator urges us to pick up the phone, but if we go and plug it instead, he gets confused. This choice wasn't written into the story, and by the time the narrator realizes how that's possible, it's too late. The game starts falling apart, and the only way to stop it is to remove the human element. While the narrator may have total creative control, Stanley is a vessel with no free will of his own, and so we find ourselves standing above the room with the doors, staring down at a motionless Stanley and listening to the narrator pleading with him to make a decision while the credits roll. I think the most interesting thing about this ending is that in a way, we as real people are an integral part of the story. We've come to realize that it has nothing to do with Stanley. His mind is just as empty as his office. It's all a backdrop.
You may be an open book, SpongeBob, but I'm a bit more complicated than that. The inner machinations of my mind are an enigma.
The words of the narrator clashing with the actions of the player are what really drive the story forward, and deep down, he knows that too. We're starting to understand who this game really revolves around, and I'll give you a hint, it's not us either.
Oh, come now. You don't want it to end already, do you? Why don't we begin again?
A lot of people like to go into a game blind. They don't watch any trailers, gameplay, or anything, just to have the purest experience possible. In my opinion, the purest way to experience the Stanley Parable is to watch every trailer and play the demo before playing the actual game. And that's because they have very little to do with the actual game at all, at least at face value. You might think, even more reason not to do that then, right? They don't really explain what the game is actually like, but they don't really have to.
Wait, what's this?
8.
Wait.
8.
This is all wrong.
8.
This isn't the Stanley Parable. This is a game where you
8.
press a button and it says 8.
If you look at what they all have in common, you start to see how they connect to the game and what they mean in the context of the game. The same goes for the Ultra Deluxe trailers. They almost all feature the narrator in some way, encouraging you to play the game while cracking jokes and poking fun at people like Raphael for being a sexist know-it-all who thinks the game is a waste of time.
Did you ask any girls to try out your game? I ask because they are blissfully less logical than us guys. While a woman writes, "This place has shoes. I love shoes. Oh my god. Shopping.
And that's because they know that getting people to like the narrator will draw them into the game. If you haven't already noticed, the narrator is not your typical narrator. He's not just there to tell the story and be done with it. He interacts with the player, he recognizes the different endings as a result of the player's correct and incorrect choices, and he has opinions of his own that he thinks will improve what he calls his story in the long run. He's about as far from the traditional narrator as you can get. This role reversal is what's most interesting to me because normally if you're going to have a narrator, they have to be disconnected from the story. Character development usually happens between the characters in the story itself, not the people telling you. You're supposed to put characters in situations that feel real while illustrating some sort of character growth. But real people aren't like that. Happy endings don't always happen. We're free to make whatever choices we want, even if some people aren't happy about it, and sometimes we get lost along the way. But that's okay, because without free will, we just end up like Stanley. This is the beauty of the game. It takes you, a real person, and puts you in a situation that essentially is real to you, and that's what makes the narrator feel so fleshed out, because you're directly interacting with him. One of my favorite endings is the museum ending, not because it gives a behind-the-scenes look at the game, although that is really cool, but because it deals with this very idea. As you're about to be crushed between two metal plates, everything stops, and a female narrator takes over.
In a single visceral instant, Stanley was obliterated as the machine crushed every bone in his body, killing him instantly. And yet it would be just a few minutes before Stanley would restart the game, back in his office, as alive as ever. What exactly did the narrator think he was going to accomplish? When every path you can walk has been created for you long in advance, death becomes meaningless, making life the same. Do you see now? Do you see that Stanley was already dead from the moment he hit start?
This is one of my favorite quotes from this game. I'm not sure how much I agree with it. I don't think there's any right or wrong way to live, but I think there's a spectrum between the security of being a follower and being someone that makes their own path, that likes having the freedom to get lost and mess up, and most people fall somewhere in the middle. I like this quote because I think it helps you understand the character of the narrator a lot more and what his ultimate goal is. I don't want to get too existential, that's not the point of this video, but I can't talk about this game without bringing up this ending because by pulling you away from his influence for a minute, it can say so much about the relationship between you and the narrator in such a short amount of time.
Oh, look at these two. How they wish to destroy one another. How they wish to control one another. How they both wish to be free.
Some of you may have heard of Black Mirror Bandersnatch. Bandersnatch is a Netflix original one-off movie in the Black Mirror universe about a man named Stefan who was offered a job at a video game company in the 80s while developing a game called Bandersnatch, with multiple endings based on a choose-your-own-adventure book of the same name. I think you can see where I'm going with this. The catch is that occasionally a choice will pop up on screen, and that determines Stefan's next move. Unlike most movies, this is a much more active viewing experience, and some may consider it a game of sorts, kind of like a game we already know, but I tend to disagree. I think what separates Bandersnatch from the Stanley Parable is that it's trying to be a movie first and a game second. We know Stanley is a blank slate character, and we've established why that is at this point. Initially, I was skeptical as to how Bandersnatch would pull off a similar premise because that wouldn't really work in a movie. The audience wouldn't be engaged. But Stefan is a fully fleshed out character, contextualized by his own emotions, relationships, and backstory, and he makes choices independent from the player who acts as a separate entity, forcefully controlling him from the outside.
What the f*** is Netflix?
The main difference is that in the Stanley Parable, we take full control of Stanley, and the only one directly affected by our decisions is the narrator. The great thing about Bandersnatch, apart from being an amazing experience in itself, is that it offers us a different way of looking at the Stanley Parable. We put the narrator in the same position as Stefan, and we see a lot of parallels between the two. The main difference is that in Bandersnatch, the story is laid out clearly in front of us, and in the Stanley Parable, we're led to believe the story is about Stanley, and only when we engage with the game on another level, like going out of our way to make a choice that wasn't explicitly stated to us, do we realize it was about the narrator the whole time. The Stanley Parable tells a story about a narrator trying to tell a story, and what happens when the player, a real person, gets in the way of that. And that's a story you can only tell in a video game. At the end of the day, the Stanley Parable is up to interpretation. It's just one of those cryptic kinds of games. But as someone who has a genuine appreciation for what goes into the making of my favorite things, I thought it would be really interesting to break down the building blocks of a story like this and how other games might be able to learn from it. It's an experience that I've walked away from inspired, and one of those games that you only come across once in a lifetime. Maybe in the coming years, we'll start to see other games try to tell creative stories like this through gameplay. Another game that I would recommend that does this really well is Superliminal, which was such a breath of fresh air to me because I thought by 2020, maybe the Stanley Parable really was just kind of a flash in the pan type of game, but it's always exciting to put players in unfamiliar situations and see what they would do, and I think we've only really scratched the surface here. Video games are still a relatively new medium, and there's always room for innovation. That being said, I'm no game developer. Sometimes you just want to blow stuff up, and if the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe doesn't let me do that, I'm kicking it to the curb.
You go, I need someone to take me home, singing, oh no, Pedro, where'd you go? I need someone to take me home. Oh no, Pedro, where'd you go? I need someone to take me